Life before the change. Robert Mitchell sat in his worn-out armchair by the window, staring at the small backyard behind his house. The March sky was dull and gray, and the bare tree branches swayed in the breeze. The house was so quiet that he could hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall. It was a silence he had grown used to, one that felt heavier with each passing day. At 72, Robert had lived a full life. He had spent decades as a philosophy professor at a well-respected university, dedicating himself to teaching and intellectual debates. His days had once been filled with lectures, lively discussions with students, and late-night research. He had prided himself on his sharp mind, his ability to dissect life's biggest questions, and his endless pursuit of knowledge. But now all of that felt like a distant memory. Retirement had been an adjustment, to say the least. At first, he welcomed the slower pace, imagining long mornings with coffee and books, leisurely afternoons tending to his garden, and finally having time to write the novel he had always talked about. But as the months turned into years, an unsettling feeling crept in. His once packed schedule was now empty. His colleagues had moved on, his students had become strangers, and the sense of purpose that had once driven him was slipping away. Loneliness was worst in the evenings. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 5 years ago, and no matter how much time had passed, the absence of her presence was something he could never quite get used to. Their children, now grown with families. Of their own, called when they could, but life kept them busy. He understood. He had been the same way at their age. Still, understanding didn't make the silence any less deafening. One rainy afternoon, seeking a break from the stillness, Robert wandered into a small bookstore in town. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just something to pass the time. As he browsed the shelves, his fingers landed on a book with a simple cover, The Art of Letting Go, an introduction to Buddhism. He hesitated. Religion had never been his thing. He had spent his career studying existentialism, ethics, and logic, concepts grounded in reason, not faith. But something about the title held him there. Letting go. That was something he had never been good at. Curious, he bought the book and took it home. That night, as the rain tapped gently against the window, he started reading. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something stir within him, an inkling of something he couldn't quite name. Little did he know, that small moment of curiosity would mark the beginning of a journey that would change everything. The first encounter with Buddhism. The morning air was crisp as Robert stepped into the small Buddhist center on the outskirts of town. He had driven past the building countless times before, but had never given it much thought. It wasn't particularly grand, just a modest single-story structure with a wooden sign out front that read, Mindfulness and Meditation Center. The windows were open, allowing the soft scent of incense to drift outside. He wasn't entirely sure why he had come. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was the book he had started reading last week. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the nagging feeling that something in his life needed to change. Inside, the atmosphere was calm, almost surreal. A few people sat cross-legged on cushions, eyes closed, their breathing slow and steady. The room was warm and filled with a quiet energy that Robert couldn't quite put his finger on. A man in simple brown robes stood near the front, arranging a small table with a teapot and cups. He looked to be in his mid-50s, with a shaved head and a gentle smile. "First time here?" the man asked, his voice calm and welcoming. Robert nodded. "Yeah, just curious." "Well, curiosity is a good place to start," the man said, gesturing for Robert to take a seat. "I'm Brother Thomas." Robert hesitated for a moment before lowering himself onto a cushion, crossing his legs awkwardly. The floor felt unfamiliar beneath him, and he immediately felt out of place. Was he too old for this? He had always thought of meditation and Buddhism as something for younger, more spiritual types, not a retired philosophy professor set in his ways. As if reading his thoughts, Brother Thomas chuckled. "It feels a little strange at first, doesn't it?" Robert exhaled, relaxing slightly. "Yeah, you could say that." The small group gathered for the weekly meditation session, and Brother Thomas guided them through a simple breathing exercise. "Just breathe," he said softly. "Notice your thoughts, but don't hold on to them. Let them come and go like clouds passing in the sky." At first, Robert struggled. His mind refused to be still. He thought about his to-do list, the unreturned calls from his son, the leaking faucet in his kitchen. But every time his thoughts drifted, Brother Thomas's voice gently reminded him to return to the breath. After 20 minutes, the session ended, and the group stretched their legs. Robert felt an unexpected sense of calm, not enlightenment, not some great revelation, but a simple, quiet peace that had been missing for a long time. As people gathered around the tea table, Brother Thomas sat beside Robert. "So," he said, pouring them both a cup, "what brings you here?" Robert hesitated, staring at the steam rising from his tea. "Honestly, I'm not sure. I guess I've been feeling stuck. Retirement hasn't been what I thought it would be. I thought I'd enjoy the free time, but instead I just feel—" He searched for the right word. "Empty?" Brother Thomas offered. Robert looked up, surprised. "Yeah," Brother Thomas nodded. "It's a common feeling. We spend most of our lives chasing things. Success, relationships, security. Then one day we have everything we thought we wanted, and we realize it's not enough." Robert frowned. "That's depressing." Brother Thomas laughed. "Not at all. It's the beginning of understanding. In Buddhism, we talk about dukkha, the idea that suffering or dissatisfaction is a natural part of life. It's not something to fear, it's something to understand." Robert sipped his tea, mulling over the idea. He had spent a lifetime studying philosophy, analyzing the nature of existence, yet somehow he had never considered this simple truth. Dissatisfaction wasn't a problem to be solved, it was part of being human. "So what's the answer?" Robert asked. "How do we stop feeling this way?" Brother Thomas smiled. "We don't stop feeling. We learn to let go." "Let go of what?" "Our attachments, our expectations, the stories we tell ourselves about how life should be." Robert scoffed. "Easier said than done." "It is," Brother Thomas agreed. "That's why it's a practice, not a quick fix. But it starts with awareness. You came here today because something inside you is searching. That's the first step." Robert sat in silence for a moment, looking around the room. He had spent so much of his life searching for answers in books, in logic, in the pursuit of knowledge. But maybe, just maybe, the answer he had been looking for wasn't something to be found, but something to be let go of. As he left the center that morning, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A quiet curiosity. Maybe he would. Come back next week. Maybe he would start small, just sitting with his thoughts, letting them come and go like clouds. Maybe, for the first time in his life, he was ready to stop searching and start simply being. The concept of letting go. The days after Robert's first visit to the Buddhist center were filled with quiet reflection. He had begun reading more about Buddhism, trying to understand the philosophy behind Brother Thomas's words. We don't stop feeling. We learn to let go. But the more he thought about it, the more complicated it seemed. Let go of what, exactly? His past? His regrets? The life he had once known? Letting go wasn't something Robert had ever been good at. As a professor, he had spent years clinging to knowledge, to intellectual debates, to the idea that with enough reasoning he could make sense of life. Even in his personal life, he had held on tightly to his role as a husband, a father, a teacher. But now, many of those roles were no longer relevant. Who was he without them? One morning, feeling particularly restless, Robert decided to return to the center. He arrived early and found Brother Thomas outside, tending to a small rock garden. "Back so soon?" the monk asked with a smile. Robert smirked. "I guess curiosity got the better of me." Brother Thomas set down his rake and motioned for Robert to follow him inside. They settled onto cushions in the meditation hall, the scent of incense lingering in the air. After a few moments of silence, Robert finally spoke. "You said something last time that stuck with me," he admitted. "You talked about letting go. I can't seem to wrap my head around it." Brother Thomas nodded. "It's a hard thing for most of us to understand. The mind wants to hold on, to memories, to expectations, even to pain. We cling to things because we believe they define us. But the more we hold on, the more we suffer." Robert frowned. "But if we let go of everything, doesn't that make life meaningless?" Brother Thomas chuckled. "That's a common misunderstanding. Letting go isn't about giving up or not caring. It's about releasing our attachment to how we think things should be." He gestured to a nearby table where a glass jar filled with sand sat. Picking it up, he shook it gently. The sand swirled chaotically. "This," he said, "is your mind." The grains of sand tumbled over one another, never settling. When we're constantly thinking, analyzing, worrying, our thoughts are like this sand, always moving, never still. Then he placed the jar on the table and let it sit. Slowly the sand began to settle, forming a smooth, even layer at the bottom. Robert watched in silence. When we practice letting go, we're not trying to force our thoughts away, Brother Thomas continued. We're just learning to stop stirring the jar. Robert exhaled as if he had been holding his breath without realizing it. That afternoon, he decided to try meditating at home. He sat in his living room, closed his eyes, and focused on his breath. Almost immediately, his mind rebelled. Thoughts flooded in, memories of Margaret, worries about his children, the nagging feeling that he was wasting time. But instead of fighting them, he tried something different. He let them come. He let them go. For the first time, he didn't try to control them. He simply observed. And slowly, just like the sand in the jar, his thoughts began to settle. Over the next few weeks, Robert continued his practice. It wasn't easy. Some days, his mind was like a storm, and no matter how much he tried to focus on his breath, he found himself caught in old patterns of thinking. But other days, there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where he felt a sense of lightness, of peace. One afternoon, during a conversation with Brother Thomas, Robert found himself opening up in a way he hadn't before. "I think I've spent my whole life trying to control things," he admitted. "My career, my family, my future. And now that I can't control any of it, I don't know what to do." Brother Thomas smiled knowingly. "That's the irony of it, isn't it? We spend so much energy trying to control life, but life has never been something we could control to begin with." Robert thought about that for a long time. That evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, he felt something shift. The weight he had been carrying, the pressure to find meaning, to hold on to what was lost, felt just a little bit lighter. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to fix himself. He wasn't trying to find the perfect answer. He was just here. And that, he realized, was enough. Facing the past and healing one cool autumn morning, Robert found himself walking along the familiar trails of the local park. The trees had begun to shed their leaves, creating a golden carpet beneath his feet. The crisp air carried the scent of damp earth and distant chimney smoke. He had always liked this time of year, yet today, a familiar weight sat in his chest. Despite weeks of practicing meditation and mindfulness, he felt a lingering heaviness, something deeper than the general loneliness of retirement. It was an ache that had been with him for years, one he had carefully avoided confronting, the grief of losing Margaret. He thought about her constantly, the way she used to hum while cooking, the way she would nudge him playfully when he got too lost in his thoughts. But mixed in with those warm memories was a deep undercurrent of guilt. There were things he wished he had said, times he had taken for granted, moments he had been too wrapped up in his work, assuming there would always be more time. No matter how much he practiced letting go, this particular pain remained stubborn. It was as if his heart refused to move forward, as if holding on to the grief was the only way to keep Margaret close. That afternoon, he returned to the Buddhist center, hoping to find clarity. He found Brother Thomas outside, raking fallen leaves from the meditation garden. Robert hesitated before speaking. "I've been practicing letting go," he said, "but I don't think I'm doing it right." Brother Thomas set the rake aside and gestured for Robert to join him on a nearby bench. "What's on your mind?" Robert sighed. "My wife, Margaret. She's been gone for 5 years now. I tell myself I should be at peace with it, but I'm not. Every time I try to move forward, I feel like I'm leaving her behind." Brother Thomas nodded. "That's a common struggle. But tell me, when you think about her, is it only sadness you feel?" Robert paused. "Not always," he admitted. "There are happy memories, too. And yet, you focus on the grief." Robert looked down at his hands. "If I stop grieving, what's left?" "Brother." Thomas smiled gently. "Love," he said. "Pure, unconditional love, without the weight of suffering." Robert sat with that thought for a long moment. He had always equated grief with love, as if his sorrow was proof of how much Margaret had meant to him. But what if Brother Thomas was right? What if love could exist without pain? After a pause, Brother Thomas continued. "There's an old Buddhist practice called metta, or loving-kindness meditation. It teaches us to send love, first to ourselves, then to others, even to those we've lost. Would you like to try it?" Robert hesitated but nodded. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Brother Thomas spoke softly, guiding him. "Close your eyes. Take a deep breath. Picture Margaret in your mind. See her smile, hear her laughter. Now silently repeat these words. May you be happy. May you be at peace. May you be free from suffering." Robert swallowed, his throat tight. He repeated the words in his mind. May you be happy. May you be at peace. May you be free from suffering. Tears slipped down his cheek. "For so long, I've held on to the pain," Robert whispered. "I thought that was my way of keeping her with me." Brother Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder. "Letting go of suffering doesn't mean letting go of love. It means allowing that love to exist freely, without holding it hostage to grief." That night, Robert decided to continue the practice on his own. Instead of resisting his grief, he welcomed it. He sat in his chair, closed his eyes, and let the memories come. He saw Margaret's face, heard her voice, felt the warmth of her presence. And then, for the first time, he whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for the love we shared. Thank you for the years we had. Thank you for being part of my journey." As he opened his eyes, he felt something shift. The grief was still there, but it no longer consumed him. In its place was something gentler, acceptance. Margaret would always be part of him. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry the pain anymore. Maybe love was enough.